Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the Minister in his robust performance, and he said at the end that the Government has learned many lessons, and lesson number one appears to be apologise for nothing. And the Minister knows that no one that I heard was criticising the civil servants. Everyone on this side of the House knows that the civil servants were working in impossible conditions, and conditions that were created by this Government. And I understand, and I can see that he's been told to come out swinging and apologise for nothing. Because, let's be honest, from the moment we first learned about the existence of this VIP lane for the politically connected, it was almost inevitable that it would come to this, with members of this House discussing the vast, eye-watering sums of public money that was earmarked for procuring vital protective equipment during the pandemic, but which instead has found its way into the hands of fly-by-night chancellors with little or no knowledge or experience of PPE procurement, but who, and this is probably the most charitable thing I could say about them, who became fabulously wealthy while making an absolute pig's ear of it while trying to learn on the job. And long before PPE Med Pro scandal broke, many of us were already trying to work out how did the brains behind this get-rich-quick scheme ever believe that a plan in which the Government would fast-track its cronies, their politically connected pals, and now it would appear their parliamentary colleagues, was ever going to end well. And I do suspect, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I said during the urgent question on November the 24th, that the absolute shocking allegations that have been levelled against PPE Med Pro, both in The Guardian and in The Times, and allegations which lead directly to a member of the other House, may well be the tip of a very, very large iceberg. And I suspect that the reason that the Government has been so reluctant to release the papers containing the advice and the correspondence and all the communication between ministers, special advisers relating to the awarding of that contract is because it didn't want to create a precedent, one which would require them to open the Pandora's box that is the VIP lane for PPE procurement. But the Minister would do well to remember there is another precedent here, because the similarities between today's motion and the motion of the 17th of November last year, when they were instructed to release the papers in relation to the Randox Owen Patterson scandal, are absolutely striking. And they'll recall too how that scandal rumbled on into February, into 2.5 months before the papers were finally made available. But what's also similar to last year's debate, it goes to the heart of today's debate as well, it's the same very simple question. Has this Government got something to hide? Is there something this Government does not want us to see? Because the Minister must be aware that the more they dodge scrutiny, so the public suspicion will grow that this PPE procurement programme was little more than the get-rich-quick scheme for their politically connected pals. And given what we already know, who can blame the public for thinking that? Because Byline Times recently said that the COVID contract winners, with direct result to direct links to the Conservative Party, that's donors and associates, have seen their collective financial position improve by in excess of £300 million. And was anyone really that surprised when Private Eye described, and I quote, how the Department for Health and Social Care's London-controlled PPE cell was dishing out contracts like confetti to opportunistic businessmen? I shall.
What do you think the Scottish public would think about the Scottish Government awarding PPE contracts, I think over 20 suppliers without competition, who were brand new, weren't known suppliers to the Government before that? What do you think about that?
I hate to say it, but my goodness, you're predictable, sir. It was probably the most predictable question I could ever have imagined, and I will come on to it later in my speech. Because the audit of the Scottish Government's treatment of the procurement process compared to what went on in this place is squeaky clean, and I look so forward to having this conversation in about 6 minutes. Because what happened is that many of these opportunists hit the jackpot on the government's VIP lane for PPE procurement, and prominent among them were PPE Med Pro, whose bid to supply the UK government with face masks and surgical gowns were put on this high priority lane after what we were told was some particularly enthusiastic lobbying carried out on their behalf by someone down the corridor. Indeed, so enthusiastic was the peer in question about the abilities of PPE Med Pro to deliver that she made her passionate pitch to the ministers even before the company was incorporated, and her remarkable powers of persuasion persuaded ministers to propel this embryonic company, one with no experience in delivering medical or protective equipment, and one of which she told them she had no personal involvement and had stood to gain no way financially from, straight into the VIP lane. And on the 20th...
Order. I will just remind the honourable gentleman, he's in danger of straying. I've let him go so far, but I just remind the honourable gentleman, as I remind the House, what the Deputy Speaker said at the beginning of this debate, that the normal rule that reflections must not be cast upon members of either House of Parliament, except on a substantive motion, which this is not, remains in force. So I know the honourable gentleman will be careful in what he says.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I will attempt to stay on the right side of that line, and I'm sure you will instruct me should I stray again. But when this company was propelled into the VIP lane, on the 25th of June 2020, just 44 days after the firm had been legally incorporated, PPE Med Pro was handed its first UK government contract worth almost £81 million to supply face masks. Very shortly thereafter, they awarded a second contract worth in excess of £120 million to supply 25 million surgical gowns. Earlier this year, The Guardian reported that they'd seen the contract that was signed between PPE Med Pro and the gown manufacturer in China. The price that they paid for those gowns was £46 million. And even adding on a bit for shipping and logistics and storage, by any reasonable calculation, that leaves a whopping profit of somewhere around £70 million of public money on a contract worth £120 million. And to add insult to injury, when the cargo of gowns finally arrived, a quick technical inspection from the National Health Service deemed them not fit for purpose, and they were never used. I understand that this situation is so serious that the company is currently under investigation by the National Crime Agency. But inexplicably, up until a couple of hours ago, the peer involved was still operating under the Conservative Party whip. And as the Right Honourable Member for Ashton-under-Lyme said, this stinks. We know it stinks. And the
Order. I'm quite sure that the honourable gentleman intends to talk about the process and the goods, etc., and that he will not be mentioning any peer in particular. And he said the peer involved, so it wasn't just peers in general, but a particular peer, and I'm sure that he doesn't want to make reference to any particular peer, but we'll just talk about the process.
I shall, from now on, Madam Deputy Speaker. Thank you. Because this whole process stinks, and we all know it does. And that's why we have to see what this government knew. This government who deliberately created the conditions in which behaviour like this could flourish. And they have to release what they know. I will give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Could I take him back to his comments earlier about due diligence? Now, we all heard the Minister a few minutes ago claiming that due diligence was carried out in every single case. Is it possible for even the top civil servants in the United Kingdom to do any sort of due diligence on a company that didn't exist 2 or 3 weeks before?
I think it's an excellent question, and perhaps it's a question that, had he managed to intervene in the Minister would have been far better placed than I to answer. But I do find it absolutely remarkable how due diligence can be carried out on a company which didn't actually exist. So the government know that the release of the PPE Med Pro papers is not going to make this magically disappear. And they're quite right to fear that in releasing those files, they are likely to blow the lid off this Pandora's box, and one which will reveal that its VIP lane for politically connected pals was simply a green light for unfettered crony capitalism, rampant profiteering and widespread abuse of public funds. In his answer to the urgent question on November 24th, the Minister, the Under-Secretary of Health for Health and Social Care, told this House, and I quote, "There was a global scramble for PPE. It was an extraordinary situation in which we had to act in a different way." And it's a defence that the Minister himself a moment ago also tried to hide behind. And it may be true that things had to be done slightly differently. But what is undeniable is that the UK government made an active choice to act in the way that it did. It was a political choice to make this an all-in free market jamboree. And thankfully, and they did not need to do so. It was a political choice to make this an all-in free market jamboree. And thankfully, and in response to the honourable gentleman's chuntering, the Scottish Government acted in an entirely different way. And of course, many items of PPE for Scotland had to be sourced from overseas. But the big difference, and if he would stop talking and listening, I will explain his answer.
No chance.
But the big difference was that our government sent staff from Scottish Enterprise over to China to source the items we need, ensured they were made to an acceptable standard and were delivered at a cost that we could afford. And at the same time, the Scottish Government was increasingly working with Scottish manufacturers so that by April 2021, 88% of our PPE was being produced in Scotland. And that, I will 2 seconds, and that government involvement had a huge impact on the price. Unit costs showed that disposable face masks cost the NHS in Scotland 31p each, while the Department of Health and Social Care in England paid 40p. That's an increase of 29%.
I'm grateful to Honourable Brenden for giving way, and I can personally vouch for what he said about the development of the manufacturing industry in Scotland, because there's an outstanding manufacturer in my constituency that did exactly that. They came in and worked unpaid over the weekend to reset their production lines to make what was needed instead of the high quality stuff they'd been producing before. Does my honourable friend think it is sad that I can't name that company and sing the praises today, because I don't know if they would thank me for connecting them, even tangentially, to some of what the subject of this debate is about? Isn't it sad that even the outstanding good Scottish firms are in danger of being tarred with the same brush as has been applied elsewhere?
I think my honourable friend makes an absolutely excellent point, and all of the good that we could and should be talking about is being lost by this tarnished reputation. And he could just as easily have pointed to the Scotch Whisky Association, which pivoted very, very quickly for using its alcohol and turning it into hand gel, and millions of gallons of hand gel. But I go back to the point that government involvement, the Scottish Government's involvement, was absolutely crucial in controlling the price. And I said disposable face masks, 29% cheaper, because they were they were bought by the Scottish Government directly. The FFP3 face mask, Scottish Government, £2.08 a unit. Health and Social Care, £2.51, a fifth higher. Disposable gloves, Scottish NHS, 9p. In England, 33% higher at 12p. Even the cost for non-sterile gloves, the Scottish Government was 10% cheaper. Now, one would have thought that a country with a population 1/12 of the population of England, would have a real job in pushing unit costs down below the level of a country 12 times its size. But it goes back to the fact that the approach that the Scottish Government took meant that it was in control of every part of the process and it secured the deals that it required at a price. Absolutely.
Talking about the member is talking about the Scottish Government's track record on procurement and how you bring value to money to the piece. Do you think that's applied across the piece? How well do you think you're doing on when it comes to ferry procurement in Scotland?
They get a ferry contract to somebody with no boats.
It is remarkable. You can always spot when a Tory's sinking beneath the waves when he starts shouting ferries at you. So, and of course, let's remember, this is the government who awarded a ferry contract to a company who no boats.
Is he aware, as perhaps the honourable gentleman from Crewe is not, actually that contract, the Seaborne Ferries contract, cost £13 million? Isn't it not the case that people in glasshouses ought not to throw stones from Crewe?
Well, one would have hoped that people in glasshouses, having thrown the first stone, would have realised that perhaps it wasn't the best idea. But while we're talking about procurement, and let me put on record, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the NHS in Scotland used emergency procurement provisions to award PPE contracts without competition during the first wave of COVID-19. But, and crucially, the auditors are completely satisfied that the procurement arrangements were in place, as saying that there was, and I quote, no evidence of preferential treatment or bias in the awarding of contracts in Scotland.
Was that your hand?
And I believe that that is the significant reason why overall our costs of the pandemic procurement were less than a third of the UK. And it perhaps explains again why the government are now paying £770,000 every single day to store PPE in China. And the Minister will be aware I have tabled a series of questions today to ask how much of that is still usable, how much of it meets the standards required for the UK, and to ask probing questions about the quality control methods were used in securing that. Can you explain that? And the proportion of PPE that did not meet the standard required for the... I will give way if the Minister could tell us exactly the proportion of PPE that was produced that did not meet the standard in the UK.
Quickly update the House. As of October, we hold 13.1 billion items of PPE. We have disposed of 145,000 pallets of excess stock so far. The majority is stored in UK sites. Around 120 million items are still stored in China. The total cost of storage is now below £400,000 a day, so significantly less than the honourable gentleman says. And the total cost for storage in China is £35,000 a day.
So I genuinely thank the Minister for that information, and I do look forward to rereading it in Hansard until I can actually digest it. But I did think, if I'm correct, we are now on £500,000 a day in storing PPE. So in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, having to do things differently doesn't give anyone, whether they're a private individual, an elected politician or an unelected politician, a licence to rip up the rule book and behave as if we live in an unregulated wild west of public procurement. And that is why it is vital that these papers are released, because the public has a right to know why, while doctors and nurses and other medical staff battled unvaccinated through the worst of this pandemic, and as the public stood and cheered them in grateful thanks, why some people with connections to this government saw only the opportunity to make themselves a quick buck. And finally, I do predict that this PPE Med Pro scandal is the tip of a very large iceberg, an iceberg that will eventually sink this ship of fools.